Hi, this is Mayank, and I welcome you all to Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those who are attending for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies. As a part of this initiative, we host webinars every alternate Wednesday. We have speakers from different domains who talk about subjects like front-end technologies, UI UX, mobile apps, media, entrepreneurship, digital marketing, and many more. Today's webinar titled Development 2.0 is focused on increasing transformational impact of new technologies and business models on the nonprofit sector. Who will be the new players in the nonprofit and humanitarian world? What new business models are emerging? Are new technologies enabling alternative infrastructure for resilience that will supersede traditional nonprofit players? In the first 40 minutes, our speaker will examine these questions and try to shed light on the rapidly evolving nonprofits landscape. The last 15 minutes will be for a Q&A round. I request you all to please type in any questions that you have during the presentation, and we will take them up towards the end of the session. I would like to introduce a speaker for today's webinar. We have with us Julio Kujot. Julio is the manager of Pulse Lab Jakarta, an innovation initiative of the UN Secretary General's Office and the Government of Indonesia. Pulse Lab is aimed at harnessing the power of new digital data sources and real-time analytics for development. Prior to this, he led UNDP's innovation team in Eurasia, focusing on researching and embedding innovation approaches into development programs. Julio's experience includes stints at World Wildlife Fund, the World Bank, and the BBC. His interests include social innovation, big data for development, and behavioral science. So without taking up any more time, we'll get started. Julio, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really honored to have been invited to be part of this series of webinars. As per introduction, I actually manage a small lab in Jakarta that focuses on big data for public policy. But really what I would like to talk about today is something a bit broader than big data, although I'll talk a little bit about data as well, which is how new technologies and new business models are emerging that are disrupting what I call the development sector, or but maybe for avoid confusion, the non-profit sector. This is actually somewhat of a personal obsession of mine. It started back in 2009 when I wrote something called the Development 2.0 Manifesto. And the reason why I wrote that is that that was the time when Web 2.0 was something relatively new, certainly for the non-profit sector. Obviously by now it's quite obsolete. But at that time what was happening is that there was an awful lot of attention onto shiny new technology tools and much less attention about Web 2.0 from a point of view of business models. So my first point in my manifesto was to point out that actually if you were to focus on disrupting business models rather than shiny new toys, you probably would look further ahead and try to anticipate new trends in the whole sector. My former mentor at the BBC used to say that you cannot be, it's easy to be 2.0 outside, but much more difficult to be 2.0 inside. And I think that's one of the issues that I was noticing at that time in the development sector. Now, I'm happy to say that things have moved on quite significantly from that time. And we're starting to see the emergence of a number of different new players in the sector that are really testing out the boundaries of what used to be the traditional non-profit sector and really coming up with new ideas and new approaches that are forcing the whole sector to rethink some of its assumptions. So if there is one key message that I would like to share through this webinar is that I think this is a sector that is ready for disruption, but in many ways is being disrupted. And I really hope that there are people in the audience who actually might come up or already have ideas or are thinking of getting into a development and non-profit work to really come up with a radically new way of doing things. So let me start by giving you a few examples. This is a project called Malaria Box, and what is interesting about this is that if you were to look at the traditional way in which probably one would have looked at tackling malaria was to basically send medicines directly to locations where this might have been useful. This project has taken a very different approach based on open innovation. It's basically taken the same model that in some ways Lego has taken, with moving away from necessarily producing toys to actually letting the users themselves of the toys come up with new designs and creating their own Lego toolkits. So what this project has done is basically instead of sending the medicines, it has sent the compounds that make the medicines to researchers in developing countries and letting them basically research and work with these chemical compounds that are active against malaria to come up with their own research, with their own solutions based on their local knowledge. Now this has led to some important breakthroughs and some peer-reviewed papers where some of the research have been published. And this has been so encouraging that now this project is basically are being replicated to tackle other neglected tropical diseases for something called the pathogen box. I think that this is a really interesting way of applying the good old teaching of, you should not teach give a man fish, but you should teach him actually how to fish. And in some ways, this is a way to make that operational. It is potentially very disruptive. It shouldn't probably be, but the reality is that many projects in the development sector are still based under the assumption of providing solutions as opposed to enable solutions to be developed at the local level. So I'm really hoping that this heralds a new era where there's going to be much more user innovation toolkits being developed so that users can take and develop solutions from themselves at a local level as opposed to just sending over to developing countries ready-made solutions. Let me show you another example which is quite different, but equally interesting and potentially disruptive business model. So this is a startup which has a presence in Jakarta but is already active in 21 different countries. The startup is called FlatTax. And what they do is basically they use Twitter to ground truth data related to floods. So as you know, flooding is a big problem in many different big cities and also in rural areas. What FlatTax has discovered is that very particularly in countries like Indonesia where Twitter usage is really quite high, this is a tweet that we just sent from the recent floods in Bandung. We could get tweets coming in to the tune of 6 tweets per second, but we're basically validating, reports of floods from the ground. What this has allowed them to do is to actually start building models. So what you see at the top is a model where they basically compares the numbers and frequency of tweets with the actual level of the water. So you can see that tweets pretty much can anticipate, in some cases by 1 or 2 hours, the level of the water. What is interesting about FlatTax, apart from the use of big data and Twitter to ground the truth data around floods, is their business model. So it's basically a freemium. The person who developed it, you can read an interview with him on our website, is basically developed it under the assumption that no municipality, particularly in developing countries, will have the money or resources to develop a system like this. So it's developed and given for free to municipalities and disaster response agencies. But then where it gets interesting is that basically sustainability and its business model is predicated on the data. So now FlatTax has data on floods from 21 different countries and can sell the data analytics to research institutes, academia, etc., who might be interested in it. Again, this is a very different way of thinking about projects and potentially very different business model, but integrate an element of sustainability into what could have been traditionally just a project developed just as a way of assisting agencies. And again, I like to think that we're going to see more projects like this that come up with clever new ways to think about long-term sustainability. And effectively, flood tax started as a flood disaster startup, but it became a data analytics business. I don't know, this is another example of how the development sector is being disrupted. I don't know how many of you have come across some of these examples, but for instance, in the floods that were last year in the Balkans, one of the biggest providers, and certainly one of the fastest providers of housing to the people who are affected by the floods were not necessarily the development agencies, but it was Airbnb. And this has been replicated in a number of cases now. So the same happened with in New York when there was typhoon there, and the same happened recently. The Victoria State in Australia signed actually a formal agreement with Airbnb in case of disasters. Why this is interesting is that this points to the emergence of what has been called alternative infrastructures for resilience. So in other words, platforms like Airbnb, but you can think about other platforms like Foursquare, even Twitter, etc., that have been basically create an infrastructure that can be easily mobilized in case of disasters and be used for different purposes to actually provide assistance in a very rapid and efficient manner. This is obviously a very disruptive model in many different ways, and it's challenging the traditional role of many of the traditional humanitarian players. The final model I wanted to, another business model that I wanted to show you as a teaser points to another phenomenon which I think is particularly interesting, which is the emergence of different peer-to-peer models. This one particular one relates to energy. It basically is a company in the Netherlands that connects farmers who produce renewable energy directly with the consumer, bypassing necessarily central energy companies or utilities. And again, I think this is we will see more and more of this type of models. I show some examples later on. And this points to another potential source of disruption, because many traditional development projects have been designed with still the idea of a centralized infrastructure at the core. So, building the grid or solutions like this. This points to a potential different model of development. Of course, it has lots of challenges when it comes to implementations, particularly in developing countries. But again, I like to think that this points to a different paradigm, which I will talk about a little bit more later on. So what do actually people in the nonprofit sector think about these changes? This is a survey that was done last year by the BEIJING on the nonprofit industry and leaders in the industry. And these are what they see as the main drivers of disruption. I will take a slightly different approach for the purposes of this webinar, and actually point to just a few areas where I think the nonprofit sector as a whole still has quite a lot of bottlenecks and rigidity, if you want. And to me, these are areas that are prime territory for disruption. There's many others, but I at least would like to plant the seed that these are 2 or 3 areas that are particularly promising for anybody who is interested in this area and who actually might have ideas on how to do things radically differently. So the first bottleneck is, sadly, still many development projects lack an in-depth understanding of end users. There is this terrible word that is often used in the non-profit sector, which is called beneficiary, which already indicates how many development organizations look at the citizens that they are meant to help. And I think there is quite a lot that can be done by challenging and basically coming up with new ways to understand and meet the needs, but more importantly, to mobilize the assets of a population that that the development organizations are supposed to work with. So there's many ways in which this could happen. Obviously, design thinking, user innovation, some of the peer-to-peer models, and obviously in India, things like approaches like Jugaad. Another area where I think there is quite a lot of that can be done is data. Traditionally, unfortunately, the development sector has suffered from a dearth of data, in particular of actionable data. I think this is an area where there is quite a lot of opportunities as well. And I'll show some examples later on of how there's companies, startups, new ways of thinking about creation and analytics of data that potentially point to a very different future for the sector. The final area I'll focus on is actual processes. So there's many bottlenecks related to the way in which traditional development players conduct basically core business processes. And I think if you were to take apart many of these processes and turn it into opportunities for innovation, you could actually come up with many different models and probably get away with some of the traditional organizations altogether. Again, I'll show some examples of this in a moment. So what can you do if you actually start thinking about users not as beneficiaries, but actually as potential source of innovation? My inspiration here is the work of MIT professor called Eric von Hippel, who some of you might already know, but he has basically done some extensive research that basically shows that a certain percentage of people who buy any type of product tweak it, because fundamentally a product is the average of what the manufacturer thinks that the users might need. But then there are specific needs. Say you are left-handed, for example, you might want to tweak a particular household appliance to make it work better for you. Or whatever needs you might have, actually you tweak the products, and that is in itself a potential source of innovation. So part of his argument is, rather than investing in centralized research and development, many companies should actually look out for these user innovators and empower them to do more of a tweaking and learn from them and basically incorporate their tweaking into next generation of products. This is a little bit the approach of a malaria box that I showed beforehand. So what you see here on this slide is actually a project that comes from someone who was working with Professor von Hippel at MIT, which is called patient innovation. And the assumption here is that the person who has the biggest interest in finding a solution to a disease is obviously the patient who suffers from it. So whether it is amputees that have come up with new creative ways of creating prostheses, or whether it is people suffering from diabetes that have come up with their own tools to measure blood samples, because they find that what they find in hospitals doesn't meet their specific needs. There's plenty of innovation when one started looking at it that way that actually comes not from doctors but from the patients themselves. So what if you were able to document this innovation and starting developing new products based on that? I like to think that this is a model, in an ideal world, I think this model should have been already quite widespread in the nonprofit sector. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Actually, in a previous life, I hired a consultant to do some research on this, and unfortunately, we were not able to find that many examples of this happening in the development sector as of yet. But I like to think that initiatives like patient innovation is going to actually show the way, and we're going to see many more of this coming up. Another example of what happens when you start taking the approach that solutions might already be out there available if only you were able to connect them rather than expecting the development organization itself to come up with a solution. It's a project that I had interactions with in the past as a community called Edge Riders, which is actually interesting in itself in the sense that it is a spin-off of the Council of Europe. What this organization is predicated upon is the fact that there are many people out there, particularly at the edge of society, who have come up with clever solutions to specific problems. These are people who have already solved problems like, say, for example, unemployment or lack of electricity. And they've come up with their own localized solution. They don't necessarily have much of an incentive to spread the solution. So what the community does is basically look out for people like that and then interface with the bigger organizations to basically tell them, look, there are already solutions out there developed by citizen experts. What if you just tap into this and try to enhance them as opposed to coming up with your own new clever ideas that are not developed locally and lack local context? Again, I like to think that this is going to be an approach that we'll see more and more taking over in the development sector. When you start mapping citizen assets as opposed to what is the traditional approach, which is to map their needs. So, for all good intentions, but most of the time development project starts by going around communities and asking, what do you need? What if you start asking, what do you actually have? And I think there is a number of interesting startups and projects that are starting to take this approach under the assumption that if people can help each other directly without necessarily going through an intermediary, that community is going to be eventually more resilient. So this is one of many of these different examples. It's a mobile app called Good Sam. What it does is basically when someone is in need of first aid, it automatically finds and connects the person in need with people who are certified first aid givers in their proximity. This obviously is a very different way of thinking about mutual support and peer support between different citizens that bypasses necessarily traditional infrastructures and traditional models of providing care. And again, I think this points to many different ways in which the development sector and the way even government services are being provided could potentially be complemented and supplemented by a solution that connects citizen to citizen. This is another example. This comes from the UK. It's a project called the Casserole Club. It's been so successful in the UK that's now been replicated in Australia. This project is basically connecting people who love to cook at their home with people who might need a meal. So either homeless or elderly people, people with disability, etc. And basically through this service, it's basically a match.com for people who love cooking with people who might be in need of food and assistance locally. What this ultimately points to is, I think, that we are seeing increasingly a dichotomy between the rhetoric of smart cities and what I hope the development sector will increasingly embrace, which is smart citizens. So smart cities is often associated in the most common parlance with major infrastructure. building grids, smart grids, building major data collection exercises that point to some kind of central planner that then optimizes the distribution of a particular resource or service accordingly. I think that we're seeing the emergence of a number of projects that take a very different approach from this. So rather than starting from a smart central planner, we're starting from smart local neighborhoods and smart local citizens. And I think this is a major source of disruption moving forward. And certainly I hope that we're going to see more of this type of projects. An example of this is this project that you can see on the slide is actually a project crowdfunded. And what it is it has an air quality sensor attached to kites in Beijing. And then the sensor basically lights up if the quality of the air is not good enough. So people walk around with the kites at night, and you have basically distributed sensors that monitor the quality of the air and show immediately to people living in a neighborhood that the air quality is not good enough for their purposes. How this project was started and how it was funded is yet another example of how it's not necessary, it's self-empowered citizens that can actually come up with ideas and turn them into solutions at a local level quite effectively, thanks to new technologies. There's a number of projects like this. What I wanted to show is, though, however, an interesting example to me where a private sector company has started to embrace this idea. So this is Alibaba, which, as you know, is the biggest retailer in China, has 500 million, I think, customers. What it has done is started by giving its employees initially water quality toolkits, monitoring toolkits. They went home for their holidays and they started monitoring the water quality in their locality. They then extended this, so this was a small pilot, and then made these toolkits available at a very low cost through their website. So all of a sudden you have a distributed network of sensors of citizens that actually measure the quality of water in their particular location. This, again, is a very different model from a centralized authority that monitors the water quality. It doesn't mean that you don't need it, but what this points to is the possibility of having a very distributed network of sensors and citizens involved in monitoring the water quality. So I talked a little bit about the possibility for disruption by actually looking at citizens and their assets. I want to speak now briefly about the opportunities of disruption that I see in the use of data. And perhaps the most classic example that has been used and abused is Google Flu. This is a particular application of it which is trying to predict the spread of dengue disease by looking at what people are searching online. This has been a lot in the news because initially this was very accurate to the point that it was, there was lots of discussions about whether this actually would supplement completely official health statistics. But then in the last couple of years, it has actually grossly overestimated the influence of flu in the US. And there's a number of reasons, but a very interesting debate for this. But the point about this is that you see that a player like Google comes into what used to be traditionally the remit of a development organization like WHO or other organization is starting to look into providing data into the same type of area and disrupting that traditional approaches of collecting data. I think we will see many more examples of this as we move forward. I think there's quite a lot of opportunities to create big data where basically there isn't. So this is, for example, a startup called Premise that has developed a very interesting approach to collect food data in very remote locations. So they got in the news recently because they were the fastest one to basically show how the Ebola spread was affecting food prices in Liberia. It's basically a collection method that combines people going and taking pictures of particular commodities when there is an algorithm that detects the price of a commodity from the picture and start making analytics this way. Again, this is the type of collection of data that traditionally would have been done probably by non-profit organizations, and then you have potentially disruptive startups that are looking into how to dramatically accelerate and generate efficiency in this process. Another opportunity that I think is in this area is to start basically making the invisible visible. This is a project that basically there's a number of projects like this in different locations around the world. One is, I believe, in Mumbai. It's basically trying to put sensors into the trash so that you can actually start seeing where the trash is actually going, which means that then you can start in places where there is an informal economy around the waste collection, you can map that economy and you can start actually seeing patterns that were invisible before and maybe create new opportunities for improving or maximizing the activity in that particular form of informal economy. And I think, again, we'll see many of these projects replicated in different sectors. Another example is the mapping of informal transport in many locations around the world, from Kenya to Mexico City all the way to Bangladesh. I said that one of the key aspects to me of the new disruptive model is they look at citizens as assets and active participants. This is an example of this in the sense that many of big data projects often concentrate on, again, providing overview to some central planner. This project has taken a very different perspective. What it does is it creates hyper-local weather forecasts, which basically means that, and gives it back to farmers. So which means that if you're a farmer in rural Rwanda, in this case, you can know in your field tomorrow what is going to be the weather, and you're going to get indications of which seeds to plant, what diseases your crop may be susceptible to. And this, I think, is one way in which you can empower citizens by giving big data analytics back to them, as opposed to thinking that there's going to be some central planner who necessarily does the analytics for them. Let me then move to a final area of where I think there's going to be quite a lot of opportunities for disruption, which is the basic processes, and I would argue, do we need, in many cases, the traditional form of development and non-profit organizations that we are accustomed to. This is an example from Indonesia. This is the recent elections. And what happened here is that 3 volunteers from, all of them from abroad, but Indonesians, basically realized that there was a big backlog in analyzing the electoral cards. They self-organized, they put up a website, and in the course of 7 days, gathered 700 volunteers and analyzed more than 700,000 electoral rolls. All of this done on a budget of $60. Obviously, this, if you look at it from a traditional perspective, this would have been the role of election monitors, and all the, a number of different organizations would have been set up to do this. This was completely bottom-up, done by free citizen experts, self-organized, online, and being able to accomplish the task in a very, very efficient and fast manner. This obviously points to potential models for disrupting what used to be some of the traditional services provided by development organizations. Obviously, there's questions about sustainability of this type of efforts, etc., but I think it points to it raises the question, could we be able to do things much faster and much more efficiently if we are able to galvanize self-organizing of this type? There's been a very interesting discussion recently in development sectors. I would point you to a blog of Duncan Green if you're interested in this. But basically a more of a speculative exercise in saying, traditionally non-profit work has been done through projects and funded through projects. What if we didn't have projects? What are the opportunities for completely disrupt the sector and work without having projects? So for instance, instead of funding projects, you could fund people. And this is basically the approach that has been taken most famously by Kiva in the US, where basically it promotes peer-to-peer lending between people, bypassing necessarily either banks or development organizations per se. What are other ways in which we could disrupt the sector by assuming that the project is not necessarily the unit under which you operate? Another example of this is obviously payment by results, where there are ideas of actually funding projects only once and if we prove results, activities only and if we prove results, moving away from the constraints of having necessarily a project. There's a number of, I mentioned the idea of alternative infrastructures and ways in which you can think of things quite radically different. This, what you see here, you might have probably seen it got quite a lot of attention, the idea of Amazon potentially distributing books through mini drones. Actually, this is an experiment in some ways already happening. This is a startup called Matternet, that is basically has the idea of what you see here is a test in Bhutan. What they want to do is connect village to village for the transportation of medicines, particularly in the case where roads or other transportation might be disrupted because of floods or any other natural hazards. So up to a certain extent, this is already happening. But I do think that there's even more interesting things that we could be seeing happening soon. This is what you see here is a map of Jakarta, but it is a map of Jakarta that is done in a peculiar way. It's basically showing, looking at geolocated tweets. So what it's basically this point to is people are stuck in traffic, they have nothing else to do, and they tweet. And by using this information, you can get a fairly accurate picture of the city and the traffic patterns. Recently, the municipality of Jakarta has struck a partnership with Waze, the mobile app, that basically looks at a number of different events that can gather the data from Waze to see how different events can disrupt traffic and movement pattern around the city. So if you have floods, what happens actually to people? And I think this points again to a very different, potentially a different way of looking at the question of mobility, but it points to structures and infrastructure that were built for a different purpose. Arguably, Waze was not built for flood resilience, for example, but this could actually be repurposed for a different use. And again, in many different ways, disrupt what were potentially some of the activities that were done by the public sector and sometimes by the non-profit sector. So I want to leave you with 3 more experimental prototypes that I've come across recently, which I think might be of interest, and point again to the extraordinary level of creativity that we're seeing in this area. This is just a prototype I developed. I came back from an exhibition in Tokyo recently where this was displayed. This was a challenge that was given by to a design company, basically say design a bottle for an era of water scarcity. What does a bottle look like when climate change effects have basically reduced drastically the availability of water? And they redefined completely this challenge and said, why don't we, instead of thinking about a bottle, why don't we think about the human body? How does it change with climate change? And can we actually adapt the body as opposed to adapting the bottle to scarcity of water? So they studied in depth animals that live in areas that are very water scarce, and then started to say, what can you apply to the human body to actually, for example, reduce the level of sweat or the level of urination so that you can actually dramatically reduce the use of water for the human body. Now, this obviously is just a prototype. It has never been tested, but the point is that they actually reframed completely a problem to come up with different solutions that could, in some ways, turned out to be disruptive in terms of how we think about climate adaptation. And I think this is the type of creativity and rethinking of problems that we might want to see more of in the future. Another example of this, which I quite like, is comes from the MIT. I think many of you will have heard about global warming. What the MIT is proposing is local warming. Basically is the idea that you can save an awful lot of energy if instead of having to heat a whole building, you basically get the heat follow the people. So they have a combination of technologies that basically warms the body of an individual as opposed to warming a whole room. And the prototype seems to indicate that you can actually generate quite a lot of energy efficiency through that. Final example I want to show is a different way of thinking about citizen feedback on public services. Again, I think wearable technologies is an area where you will see much more use in the development sector eventually, although there's quite a lot of obstacles when it comes to implementation, but this is just a prototype looking at how can you use Google Glass as a wearable technology, for instance, to provide real-time feedback to city planners on what people think of a particular location. So this is a startup called Commonplace that has developed this idea where basically you have emotional responses to particular places, that emotional response can be fed back to city planners and maybe start thinking about interventions at the local level. So I'm finished. I want to just go back to where I started and say that if you're interested in new approaches to development, this is the time to jump in. I think the sector is ready for disruption. I think many people in the development sector would agree with that. There's a number of opportunities in addressing key bottlenecks, some of which I talked about. There's an enormous scope for new different partnerships and creating alternative infrastructures. And finally, there's quite a scope for creativity and disruption in thinking about new way of funding nonprofit and development work. With this, I would like to thank you and open up for questions, or if you want to tweet, you can find me and continue the conversation on Twitter.
Well, that was a great session. Thank you, Julio, for sharing these insights into the nonprofit sector and how technology is impacting it. Moving on, I'm sure you all have a few questions. Please press the raise hand button on the control panel to ask your question using the microphone, or type it in the chat box on your screen. Julio, while the questions start coming in, would you like us to give a quick recap of the session since a few people joined a little late?
Please go ahead.
Sorry, would you like to give us a quick recap of the session?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so basically my argument is that there is a number of emerging business models that are potentially challenging the way that we thought of nonprofit work traditionally. And these business models often come from unexpected sources, from new players that were not the traditional development sectors players, whether it is Google trying to provide flu statistics, or whether it is Waze providing flood disaster management data, or whether it is self-empowered citizens that measure water pollution or air pollution in their neighborhood and then decide to take action locally. There is a number of different ways in which development and non-profit work is being conducted that point to a potentially very different future for the sector and different modalities of conceiving development and non-profit work.
Thank you, Julio. So we have a question from Bot. So he says, the approach you discuss requires a considerable amount of exploration and iteration. What do you think about funding conditions that donors apply? Do they allow for enough flexibility and agility that the innovations you speak require of to be released?
This is actually at the core of my argument, is that that model of traditional funding, which is based on basically doesn't contemplate the opportunity or the possibility of failure and reiteration, is obviously a model that has to be disrupted. And I think there is a growing recognition of this. You will see there is an awful lot of funding now going on for what is broadly defined innovation. There is a number of challenges, there is hackathons, there is a number of different activities aimed at finding a higher level of experimentation. But I don't think that it is nearly as established enough yet to be at the level of disruption where, early prototyping, testing, and failing is just a normal way of doing business. I think we are not there yet, but I do think that, and I certainly like to think that there's going to be many more clever ways of funding projects that are actually predicated on the assumption that testing, prototyping, and experimenting is indeed a new way, a normal way of doing business in the development sector. So I really think we will get there fairly quickly.
Thank you, Julio. But I hope that answers your question. In case you have a follow-up question, please feel free to type it in. Julio, so I have a question. So since a lot of us are technologists and we face a lot of trouble at times while explaining to non-profit agencies, non-profits in general, that why they should invest money in technology, because money, not the funding part, but money in general becomes a very big pain point for these non-profits to invest in any large website, web projects, or web portals in general.
So are you asking me how to approach?
Yeah, how to approach and how to basically educate as well as inform them about the benefits. What is a good way to go about that?
From experience, if you starting from a technology angle is not necessarily the best way to couch this, in the sense that most nonprofit sectors have probably been burnt by a number of technologies in the past that were promised to be the solution to all the problems, and then obviously were not. But most importantly, I think the angle that one should take is really to demonstrate how the technology is being applied to solve a particular problem that is core to the mission of the organization, and how this is done, and how showing that you have an excellent understanding of end users and people that the organization is trying to help. So to me, I find that if you were to do, say, a quote-unquote safari, or design safari, right, or a mission, an expedition, however you want to phrase it, understanding how the needs of and the assets of the people who are actually meant to be targeted by the technology show that you understand their context and show that the applications of the technology actually solve a particular problem. So I would start from the problem perspective, not from the technology perspective, and I certainly would start from the end user side more than necessarily than the non-profit side per se. I think there's nothing more convincing than actually seeing that you have a very in-depth understanding of the conditions in which technology is going to be used.
All right, thank you. So we have a question from Vijay who asks, big data is existing and is available, but needs to be more precise for nonprofits to leverage and map it to the context they address. Your comments on it?
Yes, I actually think that big data still remains an incredibly difficult and underutilized resource for nonprofits. There is a number of very practical issues that come about as soon as you started talking about the actual utilization of big data. So there is an awful lot of talk about this, but there's actually very little practice. That's one of the reasons why our lab was set up, is actually to try to fill this gap. So I think there is a number of questions to be asked. One is about the access, the data. Is it accessible or not? If it does, what are the policy and privacy implications? What are the skills that need to be had? And I have to say, at least based on our experience so far, one of the biggest obstacles is actually coming up with ways of querying the data that are really meaningful and provide really generally new insights from a point of view of nonprofit work. So what we find is that it is relatively easy to do, say, a sentiment analysis project trying to gauge understanding or perception of a particular topic using social media, but is that really something that makes a difference and that really is insightful and provides new insights? That's more questionable. So I think it requires an awful lot of thinking and different set of expertise, which often is difficult for non-profit, but frankly also for the private sector to get access to. So I think what you'll see here, and this is something that I wanted to mention before, is what we are seeing something really interesting when it comes to big data projects, particularly because we are have so many complexities associated with it, is the emergence of what we are called sometimes consortia, data consortia, or collaboratorium. But it's basically different players coming together precisely because these are quite complex projects. And they each bring different part to the table, whether it is the data itself, whether it is expertise on privacy handling, whether it is expertise on a particular issue. So I think you'll see more and more of this coming forward. Obviously, there is examples like the big data challenges that Orange did with making available some of its mobile records. But then you have experiments, for instance, in Korea, the municipality of Seoul has created a data consortium with a number of different companies to actually leverage big data for public policy. And I think you will see in the UK there's something called big data collaboratoria around waste management. I think you will see more and more of these broad collaborations precisely because big data is not so easy to harness as an average.
Thank you, Julio. Vijay, I hope that answers your question. In case you have any follow-up queries, feel free to type them in. So since we are running towards the end of the webinar, I request those who still have any questions to please mail them at webinars@srijan.in. I'll repeat that for you. It's webinars, webinars @srijan.in, srijan.in. Thank you once again, Julio, for such a knowledgeable session. I'm sure everyone found your presentation very interesting and insightful. A big thank you to all the attendees for joining us in today's webinar. I would also like to announce that our next webinar is on how to build your one-man UX army on the 21st of January by Yogesh Bakchandani, an award-winning creative professional with an overall experience of 14 years in design. He specializes in usability, information architecture, and UI design. We'll be sending you the registration link and more details in a subsequent mail. So guys, stay tuned and have a great day.